What is up, everyone? It's Quinn here, and in today's video, I'm going to be going through my week one tight end start sits. I've already gone through my running backs, wide receivers, and quarterbacks, so if you haven't seen those, you can check those out after this one, but we're locking in on the tight ends today. If you guys are new to my start sits, I go through every single matchup, so all 16 week one games. I'm going to talk about every single fantasy relevant tight end, and then I'm either going to list them as a start, fringe option, or a sit. The start's going to be the tight ends that I'm starting with a lot of confidence, not necessarily going to be, 12 different tight ends. I don't think there are 12 guys that I have a ton of confidence here in week one. So more of like your mid to high end tight end ones, the fringe options, more like your back end tight end ones, high end tight end twos. They're fine in your lineup, probably not the best options, but they're definitely playable. And then sits are going to be players that I prefer to keep on my bench. I feel like the tight end position is very interesting this year because I feel like it's very deep when you're looking at the first, like maybe 10, 11 guys. But I think heading into week one, I don't have a ton of confidence with many of the guys like outside of that top 11. So let's actually dive into it here. Starting off with the Thursday night matchup, we have the Ravens taking on the Chiefs. And this is not complicated. Let's not overthink this. You're starting Mark Andrews, you're starting Travis Kelce. These are two of the top four tight ends off the board, so they are obviously locked into your fantasy football lineups. Then looking at the Friday night matchup, we have the Packers taking on the Eagles, and I do think it's possible that one of these Packers tight ends ends up being fantasy relevant. I think Luke Musgrave probably is the best opportunity, but I also think this is going to be a Packers team where it seems like they're kind of running committees all over the place, especially with their pass catchers. You have four very relevant guys in their wide receiver room. These guys are both second-year players, Musgrave, Kraft. So I think we're going to get some sort of split. We just have to wait and see how extreme it is. If it's not, that extreme and Musgrave is the clear tight end one, then I think he'll probably be a fringe option moving forward. But in week one, would definitely prefer to not start either of these dudes. And then for the Eagles, I feel like Dallas Goedert is really like the definition of a fringe play. He doesn't have a ton of upside, but he's likely going to be the number 3 target on a pretty solid offense behind A.J. Brown, Devonta Smith. I had him as my tight end 12 coming into the season. I feel like that's pretty much what he is this week and, probably throughout the rest of the year, like the back end tight end 1, high end tight end 2. Then shifting over to the Sunday slate of games, we have the Steelers taking on the Falcons. And a few weeks ago, before we started getting preseason usage, I actually really liked Pat Freiermuth. He was the guy that I was taking after Dallas Goedert. Like if you missed out on those top 12 and you were punting the position, Pat Freiermuth is the guy that I was looking to target. I am no longer like all in on Pat Freiermuth here. I think the upside is that when you're looking for these sleeper tight ends, you want to find guys who can be number 2 targets in their offenses. Because if you're the 3rd, 4th, 5th target, it's going to be tough to have much upside. For Pat Freiermuth, it seemed like he had a legit shot to be the number 2 target. You have George Pickens as the clear-cut wide receiver 1, but behind Pickens, there's really not a ton going on at the wide receiver position. Freiermuth had 2 solid seasons to start off his career, struggled last year, but the entire offense was kind of rough. So I like Freiermuth. Unfortunately, the preseason usage has not been kind. He's in a pretty legit split with Darnell Washington, where if you're splitting snaps, you're not a full-time player, 80+% route participation, it's going to be tough to pay off for fantasy, especially in a rougher offense like the Steelers. So not saying he can't, up his usage, but in week one, someone who I'm not really, all that excited about playing. Then for the Falcons on the other side, someone I am very excited about playing, Kyle Pitts. I know there are a lot of people out there who are out on Pitts. They were kind of avoiding him. Might not be worth talking about because if you drafted him, you probably feel pretty good about it. But he's someone who flashed talent early on in his career, still very young, even though he's heading into year 4, and he finally has the quarterback play. I really think with Kirk Cousins, Kyle Pitts is going to really break out here in year 4. So I think he's a very solid start as like a mid-tier tight end 1 play. In the next game, we have the Cardinals taking on the Bills, a really solid tight end matchup between, two kind of young, up-and-coming tight ends. When Trey McBride took over as the starter in the second half of last season, once Zach Ertz was kind of out of the picture, he was dominant. He averaged 15 PPR points per game in the games he started. Over the full season, he would have been the tight end 1. He's no longer going to be the top target with Marvin Harrison Jr. coming in, but I like this Cardinals offense. I think Trey McBride is going to be a great pick this year. And then for the Bills, Dalton Kincaid's, upside is pretty limitless at this point. He has the opportunity to be the number 1 weapon for Josh Allen. He had a solid rookie year. Reason to believe he takes a pretty significant step forward here in year 2, and then going to be sitting Dawson Knox, as probably like the clear backup for Kincaid. Still will be, playing in the game, but don't think there's going to be enough volume there. And you kind of just be banking on a weekly touchdown. So I like Trey McBride. I like Dalton Kincaid here as solid starts. Moving over to the Titans-Bears matchup. For the Titans, it looks like they're going to be running a tight end by committee here with Chigo Okonkwo and Josh Whyle. Definitely a situation I want to avoid. Maybe one of these guys, makes an impact, but week 1, these guys probably really shouldn't even be rostered in like normal size leagues. And then for the Bears, I think some people would expect Cole Kmet to either be a start or a fringe option. I am very, very out on Cole Kmet this year. I'm pretty in on most of the Bears weapons. I like DJ Moore. I like Caleb Williams. I like Rome Odunze. Cole Kmet is at best the number 4 target in this offense behind their top 3 wide receivers. And his usage in the preseason was very, very concerning because like pretty much best case scenario, he's the 4th target, but he was not even a full-time player in the preseason. Like he was splitting, legit snaps, splitting routes with Gerald Everett. So if you're telling me his upside is the number 4 target and he's not even a full-time player, that's not someone I want to be starting in my fantasy football lineup. It really seems like you're just kind of banking on him getting into the end zone, which in week 1, I would just hope you have a better option than that because you can find someone on waivers where you're just praying they get into the end zone. I'm pretty out on Cole Kmet this year, and I'm also out on him this week here in week 1. Looking at the Patriots Bengals matchup, not a ton going on here at the tight end position. I think Hunter Henry is someone where if we get a look at this Patriots offense, he could be their number 1 target. He could be their number 2 target, could definitely become relevant. Week 1, I'd hope there's a better option out there. He's going to be a sit. And then for the Bengals, going to be sitting Mike Gesicki. This is definitely a team that is kind of like to use a tight end by committee. We'll see what the usage looks like, but I'd prefer to sit Mike Gesicki this week. And looking at a divisional matchup between the Texans and the Colts. For the Texans, the Dalton Schultz argument is kind of similar to Cole Kmet. It's not quite as bad because I do think he'll be a full-time player. But best case scenario, you're probably looking at the number 4 target, behind Nico Collins, Stephon Diggs, Tank Dell. Probably has more touchdown upside because he's going to be running more routes, but still someone who I'm just not super high on. I don't like in week 1 to have to be like banking on a touchdown. And I feel like that's where we're currently at with Dalton Schultz. On the other side for the Colts, this is probably going to be a tight end by committee. I think the one guy I hoped would have some sort of upside is Jelani Woods, but he just hasn't been able to stay healthy. So I guess Kylan Granson would be their tight end 1. He's pretty much, a no-brainer sit here. Really shouldn't be rostered. In the next matchup, we have the Jaguars taking on the Dolphins. For the Jaguars, I think Evan Ingram is a solid start. Probably a little bit lower on him than consensus, but I still think he's a nice play here. Then for the Dolphins, going to be sitting Jonnu Smith. I think if Jonnu Smith got a pretty legit route participation, he could be interesting, but I do think we're looking at more of a committee here with this Dolphins tight end room. Up next, we have a divisional matchup between the Panthers and the Saints. For the Panthers, I don't really think any of these guys are going to be, fantasy relevant. So sitting Tommy Tremble. For the Saints, Taysom Hill has really emerged as by far my favorite late round option. He's not really going to play your typical tight end position. He'll run some routes. He'll probably, have a few pass attempts on the season, but I really feel like he's going to produce as a runner. I think he's probably like their running back 2 at this point, as crazy as that might seem. I don't think they want to use Kamara near the goal line. I think he definitely could be their goal line back. So I think he's going to have touchdown upside. He'll still be running a decent amount of routes, but I think he's just going to be producing in a bunch of different areas. And out of all the late round options, he's definitely my favorite. So I think he's a fringe option. And I'm also excited to, kind of see what his usage looks like here in week 1. In the next one, we are going to have the Vikings taking on the Giants. Don't need to spend a ton of time here. For the Vikings, you have Josh Oliver with TJ Hawkinson out. He's going to be a sit. For the Giants, you have Daniel Bellinger. Really, the only pass catcher I'm interested in for this Giants team would be Malik Neighbors. So definitely sitting Bellinger. In a divisional game between the Raiders and the Chargers, for the Raiders, I'm a big fan of Brock Bowers. I think he is a great prospect. The year 1 situation definitely isn't ideal. I have him as a fringe option. I think he can produce early on. Obviously, the talent is there. I think it's encouraging the way the Raiders use him in the preseason. They were moving him all over the place. He was playing out wide. He was playing in the slot. He was playing in line. They had him lining up in the backfield for some plays. So I do think that is encouraging. But early on in the season, I think they're probably going to ease him in a little bit. You still have Devontae Adams there, earning targets. So I feel like he's more of a back end tight end one. And if he does have his breakout, it's probably going to be somewhere in the second half of the season. And then for the Chargers, expecting a tight end committee here, sitting Will Dissly and sitting Hayden Hurst. Moving over to the Broncos Seahawks game. For the Broncos, I really like Greg Dulcich. I think he's someone who has a lot of upside to break out later on in the season. The talent's there. He just needs to stay healthy. But early on in the season, definitely not someone I want to be playing, but someone to keep your eye on if he is earning a legit route participation. And then for the Seahawks, I also think Noah Fant is interesting. He's kind of been buried in a tight end by committee over the past few seasons, but before he got traded to the Seahawks, he was a nice back end tight end one play. So in a new look offense, he is someone that I think is fun, but week one would prefer to just kind of wait and see. So he is going to be a sit. We're going to have the Cowboys taking on the Browns. Pretty solid tight end matchup. Jake Ferguson, David Njoku kind of being drafted in a similar spot in fantasy drafts. In week one, I'm going to list Jake Ferguson as a start. I think in terms of his talent, I don't think he's competing with David Njoku, but his situation is just so much better. You have CeeDee Lamb as the clear-cut number one target. Jake Ferguson is probably their number one at this point, their number two at this point, behind CeeDee Lamb. He's going to have a lot of touchdown upside playing with Dak Prescott. So I think Ferguson's a nice start. I actually prefer David Njoku in a redraft over Jake Ferguson. This is probably a tough matchup for both these guys, but I think there are more question marks with David Njoku's situation. Talent-wise, I think he's up there with some of those elite tight ends. If you put him in the right situation, he's going to ball out. We saw it last year when Joe Flacco was the quarterback. David Njoku was dominant. It was not looking like the David Njoku we had seen in previous seasons. He was balling out. The problem is he's always going to be somewhat dependent on his quarterback play. And with Deshaun Watson, we just don't know what we're going to get. His splits with Watson last year were very poor, especially compared to playing with Joe Flacco. So I think he's more of a fringe option. In terms of my tight end rankings, they're probably going to be pretty close. But in week one, I do just feel a little bit more confident playing Jake Ferguson. Moving over to the Commanders here, taking on the Buccaneers. I don't have any starts in this matchup. I think long-term, Ben Sinnott is interesting for the Commanders. If he can beat out Zach Ertz, potential number two target for the Commanders, which is something I'm looking for, a top one or two target on an offense. We saw last year Trey McBride was kind of buried behind Zach Ertz. Once he breaks out, earns that starting job, he absolutely balls out. Maybe Ben Sinnott's kind of following a similar track here in 2024. And then for the Buccaneers, going to be sitting Cade Otton. I like Evans. I like Godwin. In terms of the tight end position, probably not someone I want to play, hopefully at all this season. And then Sunday Night Football, we have the Rams taking on the Lions. I will say for the Rams here, Colby Parkinson is interesting because Tyler Higbee not back. Rams tight ends have been somewhat relevant. McVay has them run a decent number of routes. So I'm keeping my eye on Parkinson, potential waiver wire pickup, but week one would prefer not to play him. And then for the Lions, Sam Laporta is a no-brainer, tight end one, fire him up into your lineup. And then the final game of the week, the Jets taking on the 49ers. For the Jets, I think Tyler Conklin is somewhat interesting, someone who could be relevant when you have bye weeks, injuries. Week one, would prefer not to play him, but could be a potential top target here for Aaron Rodgers. And then for George Kittle, you're obviously firing him up. As long as those other three are healthy with Deebo Samuel, Brandon Ayuk, Christian McCaffrey, his ceiling is always going to be a little bit capped. He's not going to have a super high weekly floor. He's going to be a little bit boom or bust, but still someone that you should be firing up into your lineup every single week. So that's going to wrap it up for all 16 week one matchups. If you have any fantasy questions, drop them down below. Would love to hear them. Check out my other start sit videos. If you enjoyed, hit that like button and subscribe. But thank you all for stopping by, and I will see you in the next one.